Thanks, Sakina. And I also want to thank all the other speakers today for the work you have done to really shine a spotlight on this issue and help Australia to have a strategic rethink on our engagement with the Chinese government. Tibetan activists like myself and our Chinese friend, Chinese dissident scholar like Dr. Fang have known and seen firsthand how the Chinese Communist Party has operated in Australia for a long time, perhaps long before this issue came on the radar of many Australian politicians, researchers, journalists, and indeed the public some 5-6 years ago. So when Australia started, acting to counter the Chinese government's corrupting influence on its politics and society, of course, it was a cause of huge relief to us. But what was also clear to us was that a lot of damage was already done to Australian politics and society, and in particular to Australia's ability to stand up for human rights in Tibet and East Turkestan, also known as Xinjiang. Under the leadership of His Holiness Dalai Lama, as Tibetans, we have earned enormous public support worldwide in the 80s and the 90s. The Tibet cause was fashionable, for want of a better word. And indeed, those were the golden years of our movement. But as China became, increasingly integrated into the global economy and through a very proactive foreign policy, using both economic coercion and influence operations, the Chinese government has made determined efforts to erode the support that the Tibet movement has built over many years. And as China and Australia got richer and richer over the past 30 years, human rights has gone in Tibet, has gone from bad to worse. But we don't hear much of Tibet in Australia today, and indeed around the world. And this has not happened by accident. Nothing happens in a vacuum. It is a consequence of China's propaganda efforts to control and rewrite the narrative on Tibet, at the same time isolating Tibet from the international community. There is an information blackout on Tibet today. Importantly, in the case of Australia, it is also very much a consequence of China's influence operation that infiltrated Australian political and education systems, perhaps more than in any other country in the Western world. As Sakina said, I spent a decade of my time in Australia working as a campaigner for Tibet, going to lobby Australian politicians to put human rights before profit in Australia's relationship with China. But what I personally saw was political elites really selling out their values for the sake of preserving trade. There's been a deafening silence from the Australian government on Tibet for nearly 15 years. The last time we heard an Australian Prime Minister uttering the word Tibet publicly was back in 2008. And in the years since that time, we saw Chinese money from Chinese billionaires with links to the Chinese CCP, Chinese Communist Party, funding the political campaigns of both major parties. And of course, as Dr. Fang referred to, China's United Work Front, which is really what Xi Jinping calls the magic weapon, working actively to win political friends and isolate enemies in Australia. Just a few examples, a candidate of a major party standing next to his Chinese political donor at a press conference in the lead up to an election, endorsing the CCP's position on the disputed South China Sea, or an MP from another major party calling Tibetan activists, former political prisoners from Tibet, who were protesting at the Chinese consulate thugs because one of his staffers is a community advisor with a United Front work department. These are just examples. This happened a few years ago, but the impact still, continues to this day. And of course, because of these various actions, the government at the time did the right thing to legislate a new bill to counter this influence, Chinese or rather foreign interference a few years ago. Of course, it was a step in the right direction at that time, but there are still many loopholes in this legislation. Chinese government can still influence Australian elections even today. We have heard the Chinese ambassador literally threatening leaders of political parties how they can influence, the direction of a political campaign, etc. Of course, in the last 1, 2, 3 years, it has been encouraging to see a more clear-eyed position on China from both sides of Australian politics. And indeed, the current government is looking at reforming the political donations. But, you know, as I said earlier, a lot of damage has been done. And this is all about, you know, how we can undo the damage and really help Australia usher in a new era, you know, where we have a more heightened sense of awareness about, you know, the Chinese government's influence, but also really reset this relationship with this government. Sophie has talked about the Chinese government's interference or the erosion of the academic freedom in Australian universities, and they've, you know, Human Rights Watch and Sophie have done a great report with that, had done a great job with that report last year. And I will briefly touch on the silencing of Tibet at universities. Of course, before COVID, you know, higher education is a $1 billion industry, you know, Australia's third largest export industry, and the largest number of international students came from China. While it will be difficult to show or tell conclusively that the universities have indeed compromised their core principles of academic freedom, there are many instances to support our concerns. You know, academics have confided in us that those in the China studies are expected to work carefully as universities' dependence on Chinese student numbers and other forms of funding have continued to grow over the years. You know, covert pressure produces self-censorship in this stressful, insecure academic environment. You know, specific instances regarding Tibet are hard to pinpoint, mainly because it is already being downgraded or downplayed as a subject for discussion. You know, Australian universities have many China scholars. Nonetheless, I can't really think of anyone today who is willing to engage in a critical discussion about Tibet. Many, of course, fear of a backlash from the university management, Chinese scholars, and the Chinese students. All these have really produced a culture of self-censorship. And of course, we all know how universities have handled His Holiness the Dalai Lama's visits over the last few years. So really, I don't want to end you know, my remarks on this gloomy note. The question really is how we can, or how Australia and the international community can really respond to these times. You know, we are under no illusions now what Xi Jinping can do. We are indeed in a new era. So as Tibetans and as, you know, human rights activists and people working in this space, it's really helping the world develop this fuller picture of China and really helping the international community chart this new path in China. So I just want to end it here. And yeah, I look forward to the Q&A. Thanks, Sakina.